So, introduction to teaching the big picture. Um, my objectives for the session is to help us identify key components of teaching and reflection. And we'll discuss key components of knowledge of self and training and how that affects teaching goals. And then hopefully we'll identify some key components in the methods and practice of teaching adult learners. So one of the assignments we gave you is to think about the top 3 most important qualities of an effective educator. In these courses, to be able to bring structure to how to think about most of the things you mentioned, whether it's organizational skills, whether it's being prepared, whether it's being an expert in the field. I like this slide. This is a picture or an animation after a training session, and after the lecture, in the teacher's mind, the teacher is saying, "Wow, man, that was a great lecture I gave," and then in the student's mind, they're saying, "I am so confused. I have no idea what he thought about." So this happens a lot, where there's a disconnect between what the teacher thinks they have taught and what has happened, and what the students take from the teaching experience. So, just think back and reflect and, think about why is there sometimes a disconnect between what the teacher thinks and what the student gets. And that is what we hope we will minimize as good educators. So in terms of a big picture of a teaching, it's important for a teacher to have knowledge of the curriculum, and then have a knowledge of system, have knowledge of the trainees, have a knowledge of self, and have a knowledge of andragogy. And we'll go over each one of these in a little bit detail. And a good teacher always reflects back on how the teaching session went and look for ways of improving things. If you're not reflecting back, then sometimes that disconnect happens. You think that you're doing an excellent job, but your students have no idea. So what do we mean by knowledge of curriculum? This kind of falls under it's being, having expertise in the area that you are teaching. So whether it's technical skills, whether it's medical knowledge, know the subject material very well. If you're not an expert in an area, then you're not going to be good at passing that knowledge to your trainees. And also, knowledge of the curriculum is important. You need to know what needs to be covered in that particular time, and make sure that that's what you deliver. So knowing your curriculum, being an expert in the material that you teach are crucial to be an effective educator. So what do we mean by knowledge of system? Here is an example. So I have 3 pictures here. I have a picture of Vanderbilt University, I have a picture of McAllen University, and I have a picture of Falaga Hiwat Referral Hospital. If I was going to give a lecture at Vanderbilt or McAllen University or Falaga Hiwat, I wouldn't give it the same way. I need to make sure that I understand what the hospital system is, what is available, what is the nature of the school system, what is the environment and the context and so forth. So a good educator pays attention to the knowledge of system and makes accommodation and change how they teach based on an appreciation of their system. Knowledge of trainees, I think one of you mentioned that. So it's good to know who am I giving the lecture to? Am I giving the lecture to first-year anesthesia residents, or am I giving the lecture to third-year anesthesia residents? And if that's a difference, am I giving a lecture to a medical student? Am I giving the lecture to an undergrad student? So based on that, you need to modify what you teach. So it's important beforehand to think about those and to make changes. Another important thing to think about your trainees is the diversity of your trainees. For example, if I'm teaching at Vanderbilt, most of the students could be vocal, whereas if I go to a different culture where people are not used to challenging their teacher, then I have to be considerate to ensure that there is good communication and understanding between the teacher and the students. So what works at Vanderbilt might not work, in Ethiopia or somewhere else. You also need to think about the learning preferences of your trainees, and we'll touch on that on future sessions. And you want to incorporate different types of learning preferences so that you can help your students better learn. Another important aspect is knowledge of self. So it is a good educator is good about reflecting back and knowing his or her own strength and weaknesses. If you have weaknesses in certain areas and you have an opportunity to work as a group, maybe, for that type of teaching, someone else that is strong in that topic should teach. The second reason to know about your strengths and weaknesses is maybe you need to spend more time investing on improving your weaknesses before you try and make students better that way. Interpersonal skills are important, and it's also good to be aware of your learning preferences and remember that your learning preference might be different than your students' learning preference. And knowing that, thinking about that, and giving space for that as you prepare to be an educator would be helpful. Then the last part is knowledge of andragogy. And what andragogy means is the method and practice of teaching adult learners in adult education. And our hope is that through this course, we will go over different ways of teaching instructional methodologies so that you guys will be familiar with them and figure out how to incorporate those. So when I think of andragogy, I think of three different categories. One is the delivery method. An example would be a traditional, you stand on a chalkboard and, give a lecture right on the chalkboard and you teach students, as opposed to, using a flipped classroom model or spaced learning, so that how you decide to deliver a topic, there are certain things and aspects that you need to know about each of them to do it more effectively. The other is, paying attention to a setting. So if we're going to teach in a classroom, how we prepare our objectives and so forth will be different as opposed to if we're going to teach in the operating room. And, what are the things that an educator needs to think about when they're teaching in the operating room as opposed to when they're teaching in the classroom? Or if you're going to teach in simulation, what are the skills that you need? What are the important aspects that you need to pay attention to in how to be an effective teacher in a simulation setting? The other thing you have to think about is tools. So for each type of delivery method, typically there are associated tools. So when I think of tools, I think about, PowerPoint, learning management system, apps, decision support tools, case-based discussion modules, and so forth. So each of these have different characteristics on how to prepare them better and how to use them better. And the more you know that, the more effective an educator you would be. I like to share this because depending on how well you want your students to learn, it's good to know what kind of activity will lead you to what level of learning. Usually people say, people remember 10% of what they read, about 20% of what they hear, about 30% of what they see, about 50% of what they see and hear, and about 70% of what they say and write, and then 90% of what they do. So if your curriculum is based on just reading and hearing, your students might not understand and grasp the concept, especially when they're complex concepts, as opposed to if you incorporate them in the process and they are doing things, then there's a much higher percentage that they would retain some of that information. And people kind of generally divide this into two, with the top ones being passive learning, and then the bottom half being active learning. And if you just want them to define something or to explain something, passive learning might work. But if they need to get to a level of analyzing and being able to evaluate or create new information, then we need to incorporate more methods that allows them to be engaged a lot more and employ active learning methods to get them to that higher level. All right. So in summary, a good educator will think about these different 5 categories, and always as they are teaching, they will take time for reflection as well. So goals and objectives, I hope you'll be able to identify key components of teaching and reflection, discuss key components of knowledge of self and training, and how it affects teaching goals, and hopefully you've been able to identify components in the methods and practice of teaching adult learners. So you've heard this talk, and I intentionally had you guys write down 3 things that you thought were most important qualities. After listening to this, is there anything in terms of your opinion maybe changing, or things that you have not considered in the past that you think are important to be an effective educator?